For 6 agonizing weeks, the search for Nancy Guthrie has yielded nothing. 6 weeks of unanswered questions revolving around Tommaso Cioni, the son-in-law who drove her home that night and has remained shrouded in public silence ever since. Questions about Annie Guthrie, whose car was impounded for weeks, meticulously dismantled in the search for evidence before it was finally returned. And questions about Dominic Evans, a bandmate of 19 years, whose criminal record includes felony convictions for burglary and robbery, and whose height, build, and facial hair align precisely with every detail in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's description of the suspect. And then there is Derek Kayla, a figure from Tommaso's own music scene, who was taken into custody for sending a ransom demand directly to the personal phone of Tommaso and Annie. The text was not sent to Savannah, nor was it directed to the FBI. It was sent specifically, personally, to Tommaso. There are also questions about a neighbor's security cameras, which inexplicably went dark on only one side of their residence, the very side that faced Nancy's property. And at the heart of it all, an 84-year-old woman whose vital evening heart medication was discovered, untouched, on her counter the following morning, and whose hearing aids were left behind as she was violently carried into the desert. In 42 days, more than 40,000 tips have been processed, 10,000 hours of footage reviewed, with the full force of the FBI, Customs and Border Protection, cadaver dogs, genetic genealogy, and a dedicated task force operating from a federal facility. Yet, not a single individual has been named a suspect. Not one person of interest has been identified. Not a single arrest has been made. Many are now consumed by the same troubling thought. Is this case at a standstill because the perpetrator was exceptionally skilled, or is it because something is fundamentally wrong with the investigation itself? This week, the Arizona Republic may have unearthed the answer to that very question, because the individual spearheading this entire investigation, the man who authorized the release of the crime scene in less than 20 hours, who sent critical DNA evidence to Florida instead of the FBI's labs in Quantico, who publicly contradicted the Bureau's statements about evidence on national television. That same man was forced out of his first law enforcement position 44 years ago, following an incident where he kicked a suspect in the head with enough force to land him in the intensive care unit. His record shows 37 days of suspensions over a period of just 6 years. He resigned to avoid termination and then falsified his resume, adding 2 years to cover the employment gap. His name is Chris Nanos. He is the sheriff of Pima County, and this is the story of how his past may be jeopardizing this investigation. Let us begin. To grasp what went wrong under Nanos' watch in the Guthrie case, one must first understand the man he was, long before Nancy ever vanished. This is not an instance of a competent officer suddenly crumbling under pressure. This is a man whose career was launched with a disciplinary record that most officers would never survive. We go back to El Paso, Texas, 1976. Chris Nanos is 20 years old. He enlists in the police department and is promptly assigned to decoy operations, acting as bait to ensnare drug dealers and other street-level criminals. Within his first several years on the force, he begins to accumulate suspensions. Not just 1 or 2. Over his 6-year tenure in El Paso, his suspensions amounted to a combined 37 days. The violations ranged from tardiness and missing entire shifts to engaging in off-duty gambling and acts of insubordination. And then there was the matter of his use of force. Police files, later examined by the Arizona Republic, detail an event near the end of his time in El Paso, where Nanos reportedly kicked a robbery suspect during an arrest so violently that the man was hospitalized in the intensive care unit. This single act resulted in a 15-day suspension, the most severe penalty on his entire record. The department documented a history of what it officially termed consistent inefficiency. In simpler terms, they were systematically building a case for his dismissal. Nanos chose not to wait for that outcome. In 1982, he submitted his resignation. Somewhere on the path between leaving El Paso and resurfacing in Arizona, 2 years were mysteriously added to his service record. His publicly available resume stated that his employment with the El Paso police ended in 1984. It actually concluded in 1982. When the Arizona Republic confronted his department about this discrepancy this week, a spokesperson released a statement classifying both date inconsistencies as administrative in nature and not intended to mislead. The official statement, however, failed to address the allegation that his resignation was a preemptive move to avoid being fired. Now, we move forward in time, and Nanos establishes himself in Pima County. He forges a new career. He steadily climbs the ladder of command. He eventually becomes sheriff. Then, in 2015, the FBI initiates an investigation into his department concerning the misuse of RICO funds, civil asset forfeiture money. These are funds seized during criminal proceedings that are legally mandated to be reinvested into law enforcement operations. What federal investigators uncovered was that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been diverted for things like award dinners, and $20,000 was spent to build a commercial-grade kitchen inside the department for the purpose of running a cafe allegedly linked to the niece of one of Nanos' highest-ranking deputies. Chief Deputy Chris Radke was indicted on federal charges in 2016. While still the subject of an ongoing investigation, Radke took his own life. Nanos himself was not indicted. No charges were ever filed against him, but the entire scandal unfolded within his department, under his command, on his watch, and his reaction to the scrutiny is profoundly revealing of how he deals with being questioned. He appeared on KGUN, a local Tucson television station, and publicly denounced the FBI's investigation as garbage. He declared that he was absolutely upset with the Bureau. He went so far as to challenge the agency to stand up and admit the whole thing was total BS. Former Chief Deputy Richard Castigar would later state to the Daily Mail that Nanos harbors a great disdain for the FBI, that he harbors a deep-seated resentment from the 2015 investigation, and that animosity, that unresolved grievance, is the phantom thread weaving through every single decision he has made in the Guthrie case. Then came the election in November of 2024, with Nanos facing a campaign for his re-election. His challenger was Lieutenant Heather Lapin, a woman from within his own ranks. Mere weeks before the election, Nanos placed Lapin on administrative leave, effectively confining her to her residence during work hours and strangling her ability to campaign. He then suspended Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of the Deputies Union, who had been photographed holding a sign that simply read, "Deputies don't want Nanos." In response, both Lapin and Cross filed federal lawsuits. County Supervisor Matt Hines, alarmed, called upon the Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney to investigate these actions as potential election manipulation. Nanos secured his victory by a margin of just 481 votes. 481 votes in an entire county. One must consider the mindset of a leader who would suspend the head of his own labor union for holding up a piece of cardboard. One must consider the character of a leader who neutralizes his political rival weeks before a vote, rather than confronting her in a debate on the issues. This is not the behavior of a confident man. It is the behavior of a man who has learned over 44 years that when a challenge arises, you do not meet the challenge. You eliminate the challenger. Long before Nancy Guthrie vanished, 85 out of 86 deputies in the Pima County Sheriff's Department had already cast a vote of no confidence in Chris Nanos. 98%. These are not anonymous critics typing behind a screen. These are the very officers who drive his patrol cars, who serve his warrants, who process his crime scenes, and who work his investigations. 98% of them assessed the man giving them orders and concluded, "We do not trust this individual to lead us." That vote took place well before the Guthrie case ever began. It was not a judgment on his handling of Nancy's disappearance. It was a verdict on the man he had already proven himself to be. This is the man who arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home on February 1st, and in those initial, critical hours, his instincts appeared sharp. He came to the scene himself, an action he later admitted to reporters was highly unusual for a missing person case. He immediately summoned homicide investigators. He recognized that the evidence did not align with a standard disappearance. There was blood, confirmed to be Nancy's, near the home's entrance. The doorbell camera had not been merely disabled. It had been physically torn from its mounting, and medication, essential for her survival, sat untouched on a counter. Nanos interpreted the scene correctly. Whatever had unfolded inside that house was violent, it was intentional, and it was meticulously planned. But to read a scene and to manage an investigation are two profoundly different skill sets, and the vast, dark space between those skills is where this case has been lost for 6 weeks. That home should have been designated a long-term forensic crime scene. In a kidnapping that involves an elderly victim, with no verified sighting, no demand for ransom, and the presence of biological evidence at the point of entry, you preserve that scene. You process it with painstaking slowness. You call in teams of specialists. You document every surface, every doorway, every possible point of contact between your suspect and the environment. You do not release that scene in 20 hours. But Nanos released it, and what ensued was a cascade of contamination that forensic professionals have described as unprecedented for an investigation of this gravity. Ambiance Pool Service, a business with no prior connection to that address, arrived on site and was personally escorted into the backyard by one of Nanos' own deputies. The company later stated to TMZ that they had never once serviced a client at Nancy's home. A landscaping crew showed up with their equipment. A pizza was ordered and delivered directly to the property. A home health aide was permitted to enter. Reporters from numerous outlets walked up to the front entrance, capturing photographs of Nancy's blood still visible on the ground. Content creators soon followed, and neighbors reported that in the days after the scene was supposedly secured, there was no consistent law enforcement presence to control the flow of people coming and going. Locard's exchange principle, the bedrock law of forensic science established more than a century ago, dictates that every contact leaves a trace. Every single person who walked onto that property after the crime deposited their own skin cells, hair, fibers, and shoe prints. Every one of those new deposits intermingled with whatever the perpetrator may have left behind, and each new layer of contamination obscures the forensic picture, making it more difficult to interpret and far easier to challenge in a court of law. A defense attorney doesn't have to prove their suspect wasn't there. They only need to create doubt that the evidence can be trusted, because the scene itself was compromised. And this scene was fundamentally compromised before the next sun had even risen. Then, the FBI had to return, because a camera fastened to the roof had been entirely missed during the initial search of the property. The very first sweep of the most significant crime scene in Arizona failed to identify an entire camera system. Engineers from Google had to be brought in to even attempt a data recovery from the overlooked device. Forensic death investigator Joe Scott Morgan analyzed what occurred at that property after its release and called it nothing short of a complete breakdown of protocol. He pointed to the glaring absence of a gatekeeper, no single officer controlling access, no log of names, no documentation of who entered and who exited. He said every person who crossed that threshold left behind biological material that now hopelessly contaminates the forensic evidence. And he articulated a concern that ought to trouble the very core of this investigation. The crucial DNA evidence upon which this case hinges may have been irrevocably compromised by the very personnel who were permitted to traverse the scene. Cross, the union president whom Nanos suspended for displaying a sign, told the New York Post that the optics were deeply unfavorable for the department. This is a diplomatic phrasing for a stark reality. The sheriff's own people recognized the wrongness of the situation as it was unfolding. Then came the decision regarding the laboratory. This is the moment where the 2015 grudge ceases to be historical context and becomes a matter of critical consequence. The mixed biological evidence that was recovered from inside NY's residence, the single sample that might contain the perpetrator's genetic signature, was packaged and dispatched to a private forensics facility in Florida. It was not sent to the FBI Laboratory Division at Quantico, Virginia, a facility that operates one of the most sophisticated forensic processing centers on Earth and maintains dedicated rapid response protocols engineered specifically for abduction victims. Because in the calculus of a kidnapping, speed is not a mere preference. It is the fragile margin between life and death. Nanos explained to NBC that processing could take weeks, months, or potentially up to a year. He claimed he did not want the evidence divided between two labs. He argued that because the Florida facility was already in possession of other samples from the case, it was logical to keep all the evidence consolidated. Andrew Gould, a former Arizona Supreme Court justice, challenged that rationale on Fox News, stating that the sheriff had made errors that impeded the investigation. For a former justice of the state's highest court, to choose the word impeded on national television is not an instance of casual commentary. That is a legal mind employing a legal term with surgical precision. The gloves that were discovered, approximately 2 miles from NY's home, were also sent for analysis. The DNA profile that came back belonged to a local restaurant employee who had no connection to the case whatsoever. That lead, the one that many believed would finally break the investigation open, was now a dead end. One profile remains, the mixed sample from inside the house, sitting in a laboratory in Florida. And then the public statements began to diverge. contradicting each other in ways that suggested something more than simple miscommunication. Through an official source, the FBI confirmed to NewsNation that a glove had, in fact, been discovered inside NY's residence. On the very same day, Nanos appeared on Fox News and stated definitively that no glove was ever taken from that house. No glove was ever found on that property. Two official institutions, speaking on the same piece of evidence, with completely irreconcilable accounts. In early February, as the case was just beginning to unfold, Nanos declared to reporters that everybody remains a suspect. He emphatically repeated the word everybody standard language from law enforcement officials designed to keep all avenues of inquiry open. Yet by February 16th, he had executed a complete reversal, announcing that all members of the Guthrie family, including their spouses, had been cleared. He labeled the public suspicion directed at them as cruel. He called it shameful. But while he was making these pronouncements publicly, his own detectives were concurrently executing searches at Annie and Tommaso's property. They continued to photograph rooms, and they continued to remove items. For weeks after the family had been supposedly exonerated, their car sat within an evidence bay. 4 distinct news organizations, ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN, each reported through their own independent sources within law enforcement that the masked figure had appeared at NY's door on multiple occasions prior to the night she went missing. The outlets referenced specific visual evidence, images reportedly showing the suspect both with and without equipment across what appeared to be separate visits. In response, the sheriff's department issued a written statement dismissing the reporting as purely speculative. Rather than holding organized press briefings where every journalist receives the same information simultaneously, Nanos engaged with individual outlets in isolation. Fox News received one version of events, NBC was given another, the Daily Mail a third, and the BBC a fourth. Each one of these interviews generated a slightly different account of the investigation's status. James Gagliano, a retired FBI supervisory special agent, diagnosed this approach as a fundamental failure of messaging. He noted that information was being released in fits and starts. Statements were being walked back. Assertions were being made incorrectly. Robin Drake, a retired FBI special agent, provided an analysis that connected the communication problem directly to the investigation itself. He characterized Nanos as operating like an unintentional noise black hole, absorbing media attention and generating controversy in a manner that keeps the press fixated on the sheriff instead of on the evidence. The narrative becomes a story about Nanos, his contradictions, and his interviews. And while the story is about Nanos, it is not about the DNA, it is not about the suspect, and it is not about Nancy. Drake also raised a structural issue, one that goes much deeper than poorly managed press conferences. He suggested that the 98% no-confidence vote may have fostered a toxic environment where the detectives working the case are not fully briefing their own sheriff. If the investigators are aware that whatever information they share with Nanos could appear in a solo interview with Fox News the very next morning, the statements were poorly articulated, disastrously timed, or stood in stark contrast to what he had told NBC just an hour before. The command structure is designed to shield the investigation by controlling the upward flow of information, meaning Sheriff Nanos often speaks from a position of profound ignorance. As a result, his public pronouncements are flawed, and the press corps dutifully reports every glaring inconsistency. The investigation becomes mired in a cacophony of confusion, where the real work is accomplished in spite of the sheriff, not through his direction. It is this very dynamic of detectives, operating as an island, isolated from their own leadership, that transforms the subsequent series of blunders into something far more catastrophic, because these were not mere communication gaffes. They were critical operational miscalculations, decisions that may have permanently destroyed evidence and slammed shut investigative windows that can never be reopened. Of these losses, the failure to fully exploit the pacemaker's Bluetooth tracking capability is perhaps the most consequential. Nancy's pacemaker was engineered to synchronize its data using a Bluetooth signal. Investigators had deployed a helicopter fitted with specialized technology, a sensitive receiver designed to detect that specific signal from above as it meticulously flew grid patterns over the vast desert encircling Nancy's neighborhood. The logic was that if the device was still transmitting, even the faintest pulse, the aerial sniffer could triangulate its location. It was a ghost operation, no warrant needed for the airspace, no ground teams to arouse suspicion, utterly silent and entirely invisible. But this crucial technological advantage was reported to the press before every grid square had been systematically covered, before the tool had been given its full opportunity to succeed. Whoever was holding Nancy, or whoever had disposed of her, learned from the evening news that a helicopter could potentially find her pacemaker. The signal went silent and has never been detected again. The initial search perimeter was established at a 2-mile radius from Nancy's residence. A Ring camera, belonging to a couple on Camino Royale approximately 2.5 miles away, recorded a vehicle at 2:36 a.m. on February 1st. The timeline aligns with chilling precision to the pacemaker's final transmission just 8 minutes earlier. That crucial piece of evidence sat just outside the official canvassing zone. The couple themselves, prompted by media coverage, brought the footage forward on their own initiative. They were never contacted by law enforcement. The search perimeter was not officially extended until nearly 4 weeks had elapsed. Reports also began to surface that contradicted public statements about coordinating with Mexican authorities, a critical detail, given that Tucson is situated just 60 miles from the border, and the strong possibility that Nancy could have been transported south along Interstate 19. While the American side insisted cooperation was ongoing, Mexican officials confided to reporters that no formal request for assistance had ever been made. The message from Mexico was clear. Nobody had called. It was one more official statement from this investigation that did not survive contact with the people it claimed to involve. The Madres Buscadoras de Sonora, a volunteer organization from Mexico with a documented record of over 5,000 recoveries in desert terrain, identical to that surrounding Tucson, made a special trip to Arizona for this case. They were refused. The United Cajun Navy offered their complete operational resources. They received no reply. Retired FBI agent Cafundifer began to publicly ask why Sheriff Nanos continued to refuse assistance from proven and experienced search organizations. And while the Guthrie family recorded desperate video messages to the abductor, while Savannah publicly offered $1 million in cash, while an entire country held its breath, Chris Nanos attended an Arizona Wildcats basketball game. This week, he appeared on NBC once more. He informed correspondent Liz Kroll that investigators are definitely closer. He claimed to believe he understands the motive behind the targeting of Nancy. He stated his personal conviction that Nancy Guthrie is still alive, and then he issued a dark warning to the community. Do not assume you are safe because this happened to the Guthrie family. On Brian Enton's podcast, retired FBI Special Agent Steve Moore offered a sobering counter-narrative, an assessment that may be the clearest picture yet of where this case truly stands. He posited that the reason the $1 million reward has gone unclaimed is brutally straightforward. The only people who possess knowledge of what transpired are the individuals who perpetrated it. They have successfully kept that knowledge from everyone else. There is no outside witness harboring crucial information. There is no accomplice debating whether to turn themselves in. The circle is sealed. From a retired FBI agent, this is a statement of profound gravity. It means the investigation cannot rely on a breakthrough call to a tip through rigorous cell tower analysis and through the complex work of genetic genealogy. It will be solved by the painstaking, frame-by-frame review of 10,000 hours of footage. The science will have to deliver what the public cannot. Moore also addressed the possibility of the person responsible committing another crime. His answer was direct. If the motive was not financial, if some deeper compulsion was driving this act, then whatever compelled them once will inevitably compel them again. The impulse does not simply fade away after they avoid detection. It becomes reinforced. A person who has committed a violent crime against a vulnerable target and experienced zero consequences has learned the most dangerous lesson a criminal can learn, that it works. Sheriff Nanos himself seemed to concur with that terrifying assessment when he issued his warning on NBC. But acknowledging a danger and taking action against it are entirely different matters. 42 days of public statements without a single arrest is not progress. It is stagnation with a microphone. In a recent development, federal investigators have retrieved more photographic stills from the 3 cameras positioned on the property, one overlooking the pool, another monitoring the backyard, and a third covering the side of the house. These are not motion pictures, but low-resolution fragments of time. Reports indicate the stills captured figures moving in the yard prior to the abduction. Yet investigators have stated that nothing overtly suspicious was documented. Unidentified individuals present in the yard in the hours leading up to the event. This piece of information has since receded into investigative silence. The identities of these people and the precise timing of their presence remain undisclosed to the public. A report surfaced this week, suggesting that the victim may have possessed a secondary pair of hearing aids, a pair she could have been wearing at the exact moment she was taken. A digital forensics analyst later clarified that contemporary hearing aids operate much like personal audio devices. They interface through Bluetooth technology, carrying the potential for location tracking. But a critical link was missing: her cellular phone, discovered resting on the nightstand. Without it, any hope of tracing the devices was severely compromised. Authorities have also acknowledged their awareness of a compromised utility box located in the vicinity of the victim's residence. Officially, they maintain the belief that this damage is unrelated to the case. And yet, in a neighborhood where surveillance cameras on one side of a home inexplicably went blind, while those on the other side continued to record, a damaged utility box inside that same perimeter becomes a detail that cannot simply be dismissed without rigorous scrutiny. This leads directly to the question of a Wi-Fi disruption, because the handling of this specific lead is deeply revelatory about the investigation's initial pace. On March 6th, a full 34 days after the disappearance, federal agents began canvassing the neighborhood, inquiring if any residents had experienced internet outages on the night she vanished. 34 days. For 5 weeks, not a single official had asked the neighbors the most fundamental question: were your cameras operational that night? The couple whose security system failed on the very side of their house that faced the victim's property were unaware their recordings were gone, until they took it upon themselves to review the footage. No one from any law enforcement agency had prompted them to do so, and upon inspection, they made a chilling discovery. Their dog had awakened them at the precise moment the cameras failed, behaving erratically, its gaze fixed on the victim's home, its ears erect. This convergence of details, the agitated dog, the disabled cameras, the precise timing, it all existed from the very first day. It would be 5 weeks before anyone wearing a badge would inquire about it. A potential deauthentication attack, a compromised utility box, a targeted camera blackout, and a dog that sensed something the technology was designed to capture but couldn't. Every one of these anomalies was concentrated within a tight radius of the property, and every single one was available to investigators from the outset. Yet none of it was pursued, at least not publicly, until well into the second month of the search. The detectives assigned to the task force, the 4 officers and their sergeant, now operating from the FBI's Tucson field office, are performing the meticulous work this case demands. The deep analysis of cell tower data, the painstaking work of genetic genealogy, the frame-by-frame review of surveillance footage, the examination of router logs, the full forensic reconstruction. These investigators did not select their leadership. They are functioning within a system constructed by a man who had already amassed 37 days of suspensions before he was even old enough to legally rent a car. A man who publicly dismissed an FBI inquiry into his own department as garbage. A man whose own deputies cast a vote of no confidence against him, 98-2. A man who released a critical crime scene in mere hours, dispatched DNA evidence to an incorrect facility, and openly contradicted his federal partners on national television. A man who compromised a sensitive pacemaker tracking operation by allowing it to be leaked, and who established a search perimeter that failed to include areas where critical evidence was later found. He turned away volunteer organizations with track records of thousands of successful recoveries and attended a basketball game in the midst of an active kidnapping crisis. And this week, he appeared on camera to declare his belief that he knows the motive, while offering the public nothing more than a generic warning to remain vigilant. This case will eventually be solved. The science is functioning, even if the leadership is not. Genetic genealogy unmasked the Golden State Killer after 4 decades of silence. The same science connected Brian Kohberger to the Idaho murders just weeks after the crime. It doesn't depend on an anonymous tip. It doesn't need a confession. All it requires is a single, distant relative within a public database, one intersecting branch on a family tree, one name, and when that name finally emerges, when the DNA profile is resolved, when the torrent of cell tower data converges upon one specific device, and when the 10,000 hours of video footage finally yield the single frame that identifies the vehicle, the question that will hang in the air will not be who did this. It will be, how much sooner could this have been solved if the crime scene had been properly secured? If the DNA had been sent directly to Quantico, if the search perimeter had extended for 3 miles instead of just 2, if the pacemaker tracking technology had been permitted to complete its crucial sweep, and if the individual leading the investigation had not been the very same man who once kicked a suspect in the head in El Paso, and then spent the following 4 decades ensuring that record remained buried, the victim's evening medication, the 10 p.m. dose she was scheduled to take just minutes after her arrival home on January 31st, was discovered undisturbed on her kitchen counter. Her hearing aids were inside the house. Her phone was on the nightstand. Her vehicle was parked in the garage. She was 84 years old. She weighed 150 pounds, and she has not been seen or heard from since the moment her pacemaker transmitted its final, silent signal at 2:28 a.m. It was on the 3rd day of the investigation that Nanos offered reporters a statement which would age into the defining quote of his career. He said, "I am not accustomed to everyone hanging on to my every word and then holding me accountable for what I say." And in this, he was right. He was profoundly unaccustomed to it. For decades, he had operated far beyond the reach of such intense scrutiny. A 98% vote of no confidence had failed to capture the national attention. The 2015 FBI investigation never projected his face onto every television screen in America. The El Paso record lay dormant in a filing cabinet for 44 years before a newspaper finally unearthed it. But Nancy Guthrie altered the entire equation, and now, the man so unfamiliar with consequence was being held to account by an entire country, and that country was watching him falter. Someone knows. And the evidence in the lab, on the servers, within the cell tower records, is closing in on them, whether the sheriff's office is ready for it or not. We are left, then, with the central question. After everything that has been revealed, do you believe this investigation has been conducted in the way Nancy Guthrie deserved? Because the answer to that question is the fundamental reason why, for her, justice has not been served.